Hi class, welcome to lesson 4 of unit 7. In this lecture we will talk about uh, the end of the Civil War, and we will talk about the aftermath of the Civil War and how this war impacted the United States going forward. One thing to keep in mind is that yet again Lincoln is going to be dealing with the issue of trying to maintain enough morale or willpower among the Northerners in order to get himself reelected in 1864 and be able to finish the job. If you remember from the last lecture, we left off with him facing possible defeat in the 1864 election, which could have changed the entire ending of the Civil War. So we'll go through that. Now remember that Lincoln has already played a couple of aces up his sleeve. He used the Emancipation Proclamation, so he used a law or a proclamation that added a moral cause to the war. He made a great speech, the Gettysburg Address, which added to Northern support for the war. But in the end, something has to happen on the battlefield to get the Northern citizens to feel like the war is winnable and an end is in sight and the death of their family members will end. Luckily for Lincoln, a couple of months before the 1864 election, that will happen, and I'll get to that shortly. And then I will finish out this lecture by talking about the impact that the Civil War had on the future of the United States. First, before I get into specific battles, I do want to talk about a couple of major atrocities that happened during the American Civil War. So there were crimes against humanity that were committed during this war, and I will talk about a couple of them. I would say the first one was much more intentional than the second one, but both of them were terrible. So the first incident is going to be the massacre at Fort Pillow, which is in western Tennessee. Now, this is not the only time that such an event happened, but this is the most infamous of times. So remember that many ex-slaves, when they were freed under the Emancipation Proclamation, they joined the Union Army. And there's going to be a problem of what happens if Confederate troops capture black Union soldiers. And that's exactly what happens at Fort Pillow. So there will be a battle there. Confederate troops are going to capture a Union fort that contained about 300 black soldiers. The Confederate troops were led by a man named Nathan Bedford Forrest, who will go on later on to help found the Ku Klux Klan, which will be talked about in later lectures. Now, the thing to remember is that from the Confederate point of view, ex-slaves were still property, and in this case, stolen property. And so they were not considered humans in the mindset of the Confederates, and therefore they were not considered worthy of human rights. They were not considered to be treated as prisoners of war. And usually in warfare, prisoners of war are supposed to be, they're expected to be treated humanely. However, under the direction of Nathan Bedford Forrest, the Confederate troops are going to take these 300 or so black Union soldiers and basically execute them, mow them down. You can see two different pictures at the bottom of this happening. Again, they were not treated as humans. They were not treated as prisoners of war. They were treated as stolen property and then basically destroyed as if they were stolen property. So you do see the execution of over 300 captured black Union soldiers. And this is not the only time that this happened, but again, this was the most infamous time of this happening. One of the major ongoing wartime atrocities is going to be the treatment of black Union soldiers that are captured by Confederate troops. And again, this was the most infamous case of this. The second of the major wartime atrocities is going to be what happens at military prisons. This does not just happen at Andersonville Prison in Georgia, but this is the most infamous case. If you look at the picture on the right, you can see that the person looks kind of like someone that might have survived the Holocaust. So what happens is, of course, during the war, you will see people being captured on both sides. Andersonville is going to be a Confederate war prison, and it's going to hold about 45,000 Union prisoners. Now, this is going to be way more than the prison was constructed to hold. They're going to be way overcrowded. And you have to remember what the Confederacy was going through during the war. Remember, they were already low on supplies because of things like the Anaconda Plant, things like the Mississippi River being captured, the coastline being blocked off, railroads being destroyed. And so the civilians of the Confederacy were already low on supplies, and if supplies are low, as you can imagine, prisoners of war from the Union are going to be the last to get a lot of these supplies. So the prison is going to be overfilled and very poorly supplied with food, very poorly supplied with water, definitely lacking clean water, and you're going to see Union soldiers starving to death. And you'll see a lot of them looking very emaciated, like in the picture you see on the right. And in the end, over 13,000 die in terrible conditions because of starvation, because of disease. And starving to death is one of the worst, most brutal ways to die. It is a very long process, a slow process, a painful process. And again, about 13,000 prisoners are going to die of starvation and disease as a result of the conditions at Andersonville. In fact, the only person that was executed for war crimes during the Civil War was the Confederate leader that was in charge of Andersonville prison. Whenever the Northern citizens found out about this, they were outraged, and there was a lot of pressure to punish that man, and he was executed. Okay, on to battles, and this is more like a series of battles, if you want to call it that. It's kind of different, and that'll be Sherman's March to the Sea. So this is going to take place in multiple southern states. This will be considered the Western Theater. It starts really in Georgia and then moves to South Carolina and ends in North Carolina. And basically, just about anywhere that Sherman goes, you're going to see Sherman have victory. And the importance of this is the kind of warfare that he brings into play, which is a new kind, a more brutal kind called total war, which I'll explain shortly. But also, this is going to be the on the battlefield turning point that Lincoln needs for the Northern citizens to believe that the war has an end in sight. So this will be, if you combine Sherman's march, especially his destruction of Atlanta, if you combine that with the Gettysburg Address, you combine that with the Emancipation Proclamation, those are the things that kept the Union citizens on board with Lincoln long enough to actually reelect him and let him finish the war with a Union victory and an end to slavery ultimately. Okay, so what happens in Sherman's March? Well, after teaming up with General Grant in Tennessee, Grant again is going to be called to fight against Lee, and that leads to the Wilderness Campaign that I already talked about and is still ongoing at this point in history. So when Grant goes to Virginia to fight against Lee, Sherman is going to be left in charge of the rest of the major troops in the Western Theater, and he's going to leave Tennessee and he's going to march to Atlanta. Now, why does he go to Atlanta? Because Atlanta was a kind of a choke point of a lot of Confederate railroads. And remember that the Confederacy did not have many railroads, so anytime you destroy railroads, you're doing a lot of damage to Southern trade within the Southern states. And so he goes to Atlanta because it was vital to Southern trade. There were a lot of factories in Atlanta. It would be considered a major Southern city. And when he gets there, he destroys factories, he destroys railroads, and he burns about a third of the city. So imagine a third, if you live in a city, imagine an entire third of it burning to the ground and being destroyed, and that is what Sherman is going to do. And he's not going to stop there. But what I will say at this point is that when news of Atlanta's fall gets to the northern citizens through the northern newspapers, it's at that point that the Northerners say that Lincoln can finish the job. And it's one of the reasons, the main reasons that Lincoln gets reelected. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the main reasons why he gets reelected in the election of 1864. So basically, this saves Lincoln's presidency. The thing about Sherman is that he does not stop here. And again, if you look at the picture at the top, you can see, I believe it's either a railroad depot or a factory that has been destroyed. At the bottom, you can see a drawing from the outskirts of town, and you can see how much of the town is on fire. Again, Sherman does not stop there. He is going to promise Lincoln that he is going to, quote, make Georgia howl. He is not done. From Atlanta, he is going to begin a march to the sea, and it becomes known as his famous March to the Sea, all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. He's going to basically march towards Savannah, Georgia, on the coastline. Now, what's he going to do there? And again, this is kind of, it looks like a risky move, because the further south he goes, the further he's going to be potentially away from any supplies that could be received from the Union. And if he's destroying railroads along the way, there's no way to get supplies to him. That's not a worry he's going to have, and I'll explain in a moment. He is basically going to unleash what is known as total war. He is not going to be worried about fighting against soldiers. In fact, many of the Confederate soldiers were further north fighting against Lee up in Virginia. So he is going to be unleashing warfare on civilians. Now, he's not going to go around killing civilians on purpose, at least not as a priority, but he is going to basically destroy everything he sees. He destroys railroads, which cuts off even more trade. He is going to destroy railroad stations. He's going to destroy any factories he finds. If he finds a farmhouse, he is going to evacuate the family from the farmhouse, burn down their house, destroy their fields, burn their fields, kill the livestock. He's going to, again, basically break and destroy everything he sees. That is known as total war. So again, he destroys factories, he destroys farms, he destroys civilians' homes. He will usually let them leave the home before he destroys their home. Again, he's not out to kill civilians. He's out to break everything they have. He kills their livestock, he burns their fields, destroys their roads, their railroads. And again, remember, one of the things that made the Southerners fight so hard was the notion that they were fighting for their homeland. Well, here is Sherman literally destroying their homeland. There's a story where he is going to take some prisoners of war along with him, by the way. And there's a story that whenever the civilians learned that Sherman was coming along, they would put landmines on the roads in front of Sherman's men. And so what Sherman does is he starts marching his Confederate prisoners of war in front of his own men. And then once the word of that gets out, there's not going to be any more landmines in his way, because these Southern civilians knew that their own would be the ones that would step on these landmines first. So again, he is going to be destroying everything. Why is he not running low on supplies? Well, whenever he gets to a farm, he's going to eat whatever the farm has, or butcher the livestock and eat that meat, and then destroy what's left over. So basically, he and his men are going to be kind of eating as they're marching. They're going to be resupplying themselves by robbing the Southern citizens as they go, and then what they don't rob, they destroy. And this is going to be an enormous march. As you can see from the map, he's going to go all the way from Atlanta to Savannah and then not stop there. And this is going to be an enormous path of destruction. At some points, it was 60 miles wide. So I imagine that if there were satellites at this time, you could have seen the destruction from space. You probably would have seen a long black line where things had been burned going across Georgia. There were people that were quoted as saying that the line of Sherman's troops was so long that some people wondered if there was anybody left in the North, because his line was miles long and 60 miles wide. And again, just destruction everywhere, breaking everything, ultimately breaking what was left of the Southerners' will to fight. And again, if you look here, once he gets down to Savannah, he has divided the Confederacy again. It had already been divided by the Mississippi River falling to the Union, and now he has divide the Union again. And now he's going to the Confederacy. He's divided the Confederacy again. And now he's about to turn north and destroy the major cities of South Carolina and divide the Confederacy a third time. So he goes to South Carolina, and he knows full well that the secession movement had started with South Carolina, so he's going to especially be keen on the idea of making South Carolina pay, and he's going to destroy at least 12 South Carolina cities. So imagine all the major towns that are around you, and think if you can even name 12 major towns and cities that are around you. That is what is going to be destroyed by Sherman on his march. And again, he is basically destroying all that's left of the Confederacy. And remember, even before this, the Confederacy was struggling enormously. I talked about the effects of the Anaconda Plan. I talked about the bread riots. I talked about how people were starving, how inflation was really bad and people were struggling to feed themselves. The slavery is ending in the South because of the Emancipation Proclamation. The South has really nothing left. And so when news of what Sherman is doing reaches the newspapers in the North, the Northern citizens are going to support Lincoln again. And this happens just in the nick of time for Lincoln because, again, he was standing for re-election. If you look here, Atlanta falls in September of 1864. The election's only a couple months later. So this helped save Lincoln's presidency just in time. So what's the significance? Again, if you look at the pictures here, you can see what's left after his path of destruction. For example, look at the picture on the right. You can see he's torn up the railroads. You can see that all that's left of this railroad station are the chimneys. And that's usually all that was left of the buildings that he burned were the chimneys. So his defeat of Atlanta especially is going to boost the Northern morale just in time to let the Northerners see that there is an end to the war in sight. As a result of his march to the sea, his path of destruction will divide the Confederacy even further, and it will definitely destroy what's left of a lot of the Southern morale to keep fighting. Remember, if they're fighting for their homeland, they have to have a homeland left to fight for. And their homeland is already hurting because of the Anaconda Plan, and now Sherman is making it even worse. In fact, if you were to have done a poll of Southerners and asked them who was their least favorite person, it wouldn't be Lincoln probably. It probably wouldn't even be Grant. It would probably be Sherman because of his unleashing of total war directly on the homeland of the Southerners. He did not face very much resistance at all, again, because most of the Confederate troops were north of him, fighting in places like Virginia, fighting with Lee. So this comes at just the right moment, again, to help Lincoln get reelected and finish out the war. And that is a very important thing to note because had Lincoln's opponent won, the war could have ended very differently. Okay, on to the election of 1864. And I made this look like a battle as well because it was a political battle. This one is one that Lincoln's involved in. And so this is going to be an election that takes place only among the Union states. The Confederate states are not going to be participating in this election because they did not recognize the United States as their country anymore, even though technically they never had won their independence, so technically the United States was their country, but they didn't recognize it as such. So when Lincoln runs for re-election, he is facing a lot of pressure. A lot of pressure, especially leading up to Sherman taking Atlanta. Now, ultimately, you can see that he wins. And also, if you will, take a moment and look at who in this cartoon is seen as the person that can keep the Union together. You are about to be reintroduced again to George McClellan. So, in this election, Lincoln, up until the fall of Atlanta, did expect to lose because the war was unpopular. There were a lot of people that said to Lincoln, if you just take back the Emancipation Proclamation, if you just allow the South to keep their slaves, then they will be willing to stop fighting because they're already tired of the destruction. Let them keep slavery. They'll probably come back into the Union. And Lincoln is going to refuse. He's going to say basically that if he's promised 4 million people their freedom, that he would be, quote, damned to eternity if he took back that promise. So he's going to be, at this point, uncompromising about emancipation in the Confederate States. Now, whether or not slavery will continue in the border states, that's yet to be seen. At this point, it does continue. But in the Confederate States, he is not going to take back his promise to those that he has liberated. So again, he's getting desperate, and he is going to pull a couple of desperate measures. One thing he's going to do is he's going to have the Republican Party be rebranded as the, quote, Union Party for this election, because it sounded nicer, and it sounded like it would get more votes. Another thing he's going to do is he's going to pick a different vice president. He's going to pick pretty much the only Southerner that did not secede with his state, a ex-senator from Tennessee, named Andrew Johnson. So he's going to pick a Southerner to put on the ticket, hoping that that'll help him win some of the border states. Now look who his opponent is. Someone that the Northerners had loved for a long time, and that is going to be George McClellan, running for the Democrat Party. And George McClellan, up until the fall of Atlanta, looked like he could win this election. And again, remember, Lincoln is not willing to compromise. Lincoln wants to end the war. He wants to end the war, and he wants to eventually end slavery, not just in the Confederate States, but everywhere. He's already preparing the 13th Amendment, which will end slavery everywhere, and we'll talk about that later. But again, Lincoln wants to finish the war with a Union victory, and he wants to end slavery in the Confederate States for sure, but he also now wants to end slavery everywhere. So at this point, you could largely consider Lincoln to be an abolitionist. He would not have been an abolitionist at the beginning of the war. Even whenever he did the Emancipation Proclamation, he did it more for military reasons, to keep Britain out of the war. He did it for political reasons, to get the North on board with the war again. But at this point, you can start saying that he has become more of a humanitarian in his opposition to the opposition to slavery. So it's a little bit complicated whenever you talk about McClellan's candidacy, because McClellan himself wanted to keep the war going, but he also would have been okay with ending the war with a Union victory and allowing the Confederacy to rejoin and keep slavery. His official party, the Democrats, their platform wanted to end the war immediately and negotiate a peace with the Confederacy that may or may not have let the Confederacy be independent. But the one thing that you could say would likely have happened is that if McClellan had been elected, the Confederacy would have been allowed to keep slavery. Whether that would have been as an independent nation or as rejoined with the Union, that's hard to say. But either way, had McClellan won, I think it's safe to say that slavery would have continued. Again, that's a very complicated issue because basically McClellan does not agree with his own party's platform, which actually makes him a pretty weak candidate in the end. You add that with the fact that Lincoln has seen the fall of Atlanta, and the Northerners are inspired by the fall of Atlanta. Lincoln is going to ultimately be able to win. So long story short, Lincoln is able to get the last morale boost he needs. He had the Emancipation Proclamation as a morale boost. He had the Gettysburg Address as a morale boost. And now he has the fall of Atlanta, which makes the war's end in sight. You combine that with the fact that McClellan's not agreeing with his own party on how to end the war and what to do with the continuation of the war. Lincoln's going to win. He's going to win pretty easily. But that was not evident until up until the election of 1864. So McClellan's going to take on Lincoln a third time. Twice as general, he didn't do what Lincoln said, and this time he's going to take him on as his political opposition. But in the end, Lincoln wins. And when Lincoln wins, that's very important because Lincoln can now finish the war on the terms that he sees fit, which means he will not let the Confederacy leave the Union, and he will end slavery. So the significance, again, of this election is that Lincoln holds on long enough to win the election and to finish the war that had started under his watch. And now that he has won election, and if you look at the electoral vote, he wins the electoral vote in a landslide, 212 to 21. And of course, you'll notice the Confederate States didn't participate. Now that he has won this election, remember, this is the first election after the Emancipation Proclamation. So he sees this as a mandate from the American people in the North to go ahead and end slavery everywhere. And so he is going to start pushing pretty aggressively, even before he's sworn into a second term, for the passage of a 13th Amendment to end slavery everywhere. And since the end of the war is in sight, he's not really worried about the border states getting mad about this. So now he's pushing for the ending of slavery, not just in the Confederate States, but in the border states. In other words, he's pushing for abolitionism everywhere through a new law, the 13th Amendment. And ultimately, that law will be passed. Now, let's shift over to the Eastern Theater, back to Lee and Grant. Remember, that fight is ongoing, and for a while that ongoing fight was hurting Lincoln's popularity. Well, it's about to wind down with Lee surrendering. So the final event, the final military event of the Civil War that we will discuss will be the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse. This will happen in Virginia, and the result will be a final Union victory, not just in this battle, but in the war overall. So as you can see, Grant was chasing after Lee. Grant was chasing after Lee, if you look at the map over and over again. And finally, Grant is going to have Lee surrounded at Appomattox Courthouse, and Lee won't be able to just run away at this point, and he will see no choice but to surrender. So Lee continued to lose to Grant in Virginia. That picture there is a picture of the burning of Richmond. I'll come back to that in a moment. But Lee is going to continue losing to Grant. He is going to try to drag the war out, but once Lee hears of the election results and knows that Lincoln's going to be around potentially for another 4 years to continue the war, Lee has heard about Atlanta. He's heard about Sherman's march and all of that destruction. Lee knows that it's pointless to keep fighting. So he's going to retreat Richmond. He's not going to be able to save Richmond, and the Union under Grant's watch is going to burn the Confederate capital, capture and burn the Confederate capital. So you know that things are pretty much over with at this point. So in the next couple of pictures, you'll see the destruction of Richmond, actual photographs of what was left of Richmond at the time, and then I'll get to Lee's actual surrender. So if you look there, you can see that the buildings are pretty much shells. Just the outer shell of the building is what's left. And again, this was the Confederate capital. Here again, you see the destruction is pretty total. By the way, Grant was known to do total war as well, so civilian homes would have been burned as well. So again, Lee is going to surrender to Grant in a small town called Appomattox Courthouse. That is where he is surrounded. He already knows that this is no longer a war that is winnable. Lincoln has been reelected. And there is an interesting side story. I'm not sure that I talked about this before, whenever I talked about the first Battle of Bull Run. If I have, then I'll just repeat it. But the Battle of Bull Run was fought almost literally in the front yard of a man named Wilmer McLean. Wilmer McLean, after the Battle of Bull Run, said, I want to get away from all of this fighting, so he moved. And where did he move to? To the tiny town of Appomattox Courthouse. And then at Appomattox Courthouse, Grant is going to accept Lee's surrender in Wilmer McLean's front parlor. So you can almost literally say, this is an incredible coincidence in American history. You can almost literally say that the war began in Wilmer McLean's front yard and ended in his front parlor. So in this picture, you see Lee surrendering formally to Grant, thus, for all real purposes, ending the war. There is going to be a little bit of sporadic fighting that happens elsewhere during the next few weeks, but when Lee surrenders, the war is pretty much over. And that's actually another thing that relates to the Confederacy, because remember that because of a Confederacy, they didn't really listen to President Jefferson Davis very much. And in fact, Jefferson Davis had told Lee not to surrender, but to instead try to keep fighting going elsewhere in the country. But Lee disobeys those orders, and he is going to surrender. And I do think it's important that you highlight where it says Grant's terms of surrender were generous and he let the Confederates return home with no charges of treason. All of the men that were fighting against Grant, including Lee himself, could have been put on trial and executed for treason, but Grant is going to be extremely generous in his terms of surrender and let them return home. If they had personal weapons of their own, they were even allowed to take those home and they would not be charged with treason. Why is that? Well, I'll explain whenever I get to the significance part of this chart, but keep that in mind how lenient, how generous, how nice the Union is now that the fighting is over. Remember, from the Union point of view, this was never a war against another country. It was a war against rebelling states. So there you see another depiction of the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. And you can see that Lee was accepting the surrender in as dignified a manner as possible. In fact, witnesses said that Lee was more dignified and more honorable looking than Grant had been. So with the surrender of Lee, the war is essentially over. And as a result of this, the Union will win and the United States will be preserved. So if you ever ask somebody or someone ever asks you who won the Civil War, the honest, accurate answer is the United States. And so the Union will be preserved, and the next step is that since the Confederacy never officially became a separate country and therefore officially, legally was never seen as another country, the treatment of the Confederacy, at least according to Lincoln and Grant, the treatment is going to be lenient. That's kind of the hope. The desire is, it's almost like a family that has a fight. And once the family fight is over, you want to get it over with as soon as possible and reconcile as soon as possible. Go back to normal as soon as possible. So Grant's terms of surrender, because he was so lenient, kind of foreshadowed Lincoln's desire to also be very conciliatory and to reconcile with the South as quickly and easily and as smoothly as possible. And had Lincoln not been assassinated within a week of this surrender, the reconstruction of the South could have gone very differently. And there could have been much more of a reconciliatory mood to Reconstruction. However, Lincoln will die and things will not go so well for the South, largely as a result. So the next two lectures, the final two lectures after this one, will talk about the reconstruction of the South and the treatment of the South at the hands of the federal government. Remember that Grant's terms of surrender are going to signal that they want to get things back to normal as quickly as possible. Lincoln also feels that way, but Lincoln is going to be dead within a week of the event that you see in the painting in the lecture, within a week of Lee's surrender. More on that later. Now let's talk about the impact of the Civil War overall. So this last part, honestly, you should probably highlight the entire rest of this lecture. What is the impact of the Civil War on the United States? And obviously, it's enormous. So the whole rest of this lecture should be highlighted, bolded, however you emphasize things in your notes. This is where you just pretty much emphasize the rest of the lecture. Okay, so impact number one of the Civil War, obviously, is that the first mission of preserving the Union, that mission will be obtained. So the Civil War will prevent Southern secession and it will reunite the states. And that's enormously important because if the Confederacy had succeeded in seceding from the Union, it would have set the precedent that future states could secede from the Union, and then we may no longer have a United States. We might have 50 little states, 50 little countries that were all weak. So the preservation of the Union, which was Lincoln's first goal and his goal throughout the war, that goal will be met. The next question that will be answered by the Civil War is the issue of what happens when there's disagreement between states and the federal government, the issue of nullification. Well, the issue of nullification will largely be resolved by the Civil War, and the war will establish that the federal government is supreme over the states. In fact, 11 states had formally tried to leave the Union, and the federal government had said no. And so the issue of nullification is largely put to bed. The issue of secession is largely put to bed. They are no longer major issues and have no longer been major issues since the Civil War. Every once in a while, you'll have an issue where a state will threaten to secede from the Union, but it's never seen as a serious threat. The issue of nullification, there's not been a serious issue of nullification since the Civil War. I mean, you could say that in recent years, federal law has said that marijuana was illegal and that some states started to legalize marijuana, but that's not nearly as serious of an issue as, say, tariff issues or the issue of slavery. So for all serious issues, nullification and secession are no longer really seriously talked about. Okay, before I get to impacts 3, 4, 5, and 6, let's talk about what happens in terms of laws that get passed during the Civil War, because they will have an impact. Remember, whenever this Confederacy is claiming to be its own country, the Southern congressmen, Southern senators are not in Congress, and therefore Congress can start making lots of laws that favor the North and the West because there is no Southern opposition. Before I get into that, take a note of the picture above, and you'll see that the Capitol Dome, the construction of the Capitol Dome continued during the Civil War, even though it was very expensive, as a symbol that the federal government would continue to be in operation even if Civil War was happening, which, again, the dome did get completed. One of the reasons that Abraham Lincoln stood up for re-election and did not suspend elections during the 1864 campaign was because he wanted to show that the government was still operating as usual despite the claims of the southern states. Okay, so now we're in the dotted boxes. So Congress during the Civil War, remember, is going to be able to pass a lot of laws that benefit the North. They're going to be able to pass a lot of laws that benefit the West. And they're going to be able to pass 3 major amendments to the Constitution, or get at least put in motion 3 major amendments to the Constitution to benefit Black Americans, especially the freedmen, those that had been slaves up until this point. And there is not going to be any Southern opposition because the South during the Civil War is considering itself to be a separate country. So basically, the Congress is operating without Southern states, and they can pass laws that largely benefit the North, especially Northern industry. They're going to be able to pass laws that impact westward expansion, and they're going to pass laws that can help increase racial equality throughout the country. Now, I will tell you that the laws related to racial equality are largely going to fail for a long time once Reconstruction of the South ends, and I'll talk more about that in the final lecture of this unit. So, first, there was a law that benefited the North, and that was called the Morrill Tariff Act. This is going to be a high protective tariff that the South could not object to because they were not participating in the federal government during the war, but it did help the Union military get paid for. It funded the Union Army's efforts. It also protected Northern businesses, yet again, from foreign competition. So during and after the Civil War, you will see businesses boom, especially in the northern part of the country. You're in fact going to have a second industrial revolution that's going to look like the first industrial revolution but on steroids. And so whenever you get to American history too, you'll learn about the rise of some of the big businessmen like Rockefeller and Carnegie, and the further growth of the oil industry, the railroad industry, the steel industry, and lots of other big businesses. You're going to have the richest businessmen living ever in American history, largely during the time after the Civil War, largely because the government's going to pass a lot of pro-business policies because the South isn't there to stop it. Another thing you're going to see is a series of laws passed to benefit westward expansion. Remember that one of the things that had led to tension between the North and the South leading up to the Civil War was tension over slavery in the West. Well, when the South is gone, Congress is going to start passing laws that benefit the West and start accelerating westward expansion. So, for example, you have the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act is going to make land out west, say in the Louisiana Territory, or in the land of the Mexican Cession, or in the Oregon Territory, it's going to be incredibly cheap. If you maintained a dwelling for 5 years in the West, you got 160 acres of land for $10, which comes out to 16 cents an acre, which is an incredible deal, at least on paper. Now, in reality, a lot of this land was not very good for farming. It was not very beneficial for ranching, but you will see people at least try to move out there because the land is very cheap. Another law that gets passed is a law that's going to give people the skills they need to live in this new Western land, and that'll be the Morrill Land Grant Act. And what that will do is it will take some of the sale, the revenue from the sale of land, and start creating agricultural colleges, technical colleges, to give people the skills they needed to live out west. NC State University was one of the universities that was created under the Morrill Land Grant Act, and you've seen a lot of A&T colleges. The A&T usually stands for agricultural and technical. So it's going to give people the skills they need to be successful in farming in this harsher Western environment. It's going to give people the skills they might need to raise cattle there. It'll give them technical skills, engineering skills to build mines like gold and silver mines out west, or to build railroads and bridges that would be needed to construct the railroads. So basically, the Homestead Act is going to give people the cheap land. The Morrill Land Grant Act is going to give people the skills they need to live out west. And then finally, you're going to need something to connect people to the west. Remember how the Erie Canal made people want to move to western New York, and how the National Road made people want to move further west? Well, now you're finally going to have a law passed to build a transcontinental railroad. Note, it's along a northern route, but you will have a law passed to build a transcontinental railroad to encourage westward expansion. And so the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad will begin during the Civil War, and it will be completed just 7 years after its construction begins in 1869. And once that happens, you will see westward expansion accelerate at an exponential rate. So you have 3 major laws passed that benefit westward expansion. And again, the issue of slavery in the West, by the end of the war, will be solved. There will be no slavery in the West, and you won't see the North and South fighting over slavery in the West. And as you can see from these dotted boxes, I will talk about how those create post-Civil War impacts in a moment, so you'll follow those arrows in a moment. But first, let me talk about the Civil War amendments. During the Civil War, there is going to be, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation issued by President Lincoln. And soon after the Civil War, as the Civil War is wrapping up, you're going to see the beginning of the passage of the 13th Amendment. There are 3 amendments passed at the end of the Civil War and at the beginning of Reconstruction. They're either called, sometimes they're called the Civil War Amendments. That's what I'll call them because they resulted from the Civil War. Sometimes they'll be called the Reconstruction Amendments because they don't become official until the Civil War has ended and Reconstruction begins. Either way is fine, but there are 3 of them. So they all deal with the issue of slavery and what to do with ex-slaves, which are sometimes called freedmen. So the 13th Amendment will build upon the Emancipation Proclamation, and it won't just end slavery, but it will end slavery everywhere, not just in certain places. The 14th Amendment will then answer the question of what do you do with these freed men and women? What do you do with these 4 million ex-slaves? Are they going to be second-class citizens, or will they be full-on citizens with equal rights? And in the end, the 14th Amendment, which is a very significant amendment, will be passed, and it will say that anyone that is born in the United States or anyone that goes through the naturalization process of becoming a citizen, they are then citizens. And if you are a citizen, then you are guaranteed equal protection under the law. And I do want you to write what's in parentheses there this time because it's very important. If you are considered a citizen, it doesn't matter how you became a citizen, it doesn't matter how long you've been a citizen. Once you are a citizen, you are entitled to be treated the same as every other citizen under the law. which means that all of these ex-slaves are, because they were born in the United States, automatically entitled to citizenship and thus equality. And the South is going to have a very hard time with that, and I'll talk more about their resistance to that later. They're also going to have a very tough time with the 15th Amendment and will resist that as well, and I'll talk about that later. The 15th Amendment is going to give suffrage to ex-slaves. The 15th Amendment is going to say that you cannot deny people the right to vote based on race, which can apply to any race. But in the context of the post-Civil War years, obviously that's really focusing on black suffrage, on the, and remember suffrage means the right to vote. It's going to focus on the right to vote for ex-slaves in the South. And which party do you think they will vote for? The party of Abraham Lincoln, the Republican Party. More on the impact of that a little bit later on. We'll follow the arrow coming off of that box in a moment. But the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are enormously important, and I will tell you that eventually the southern states are going to find ways to basically go around the 13th Amendment and go around the 14th Amendment and go around the 15th Amendment. And while technically not violating them, they're going to exploit some loopholes and pretty much undo the effect of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. More on that later on. Okay, so let's go back to the impacts of the Civil War. Let's talk about how the Morrill Tariff Act and other pro-business laws impacted the country going forward. So after the war is over, both during and after the war, you're going to see that federal policies will support the growth of industry, the growth of business, and you will see, like I said before, another industrial revolution that's even bigger than the one that we talked about in previous units. If you look at the picture there, you can see a lot of oil wells drilling for oil. The country is definitely going to become increasingly dependent on oil and things that can be derived from it, like kerosene and gasoline, in the years following the Civil War. So in the years after the Civil War, you will see a second industrial revolution that will be much bigger than the first industrial revolution that you've already learned about. And the second industrial revolution will be a major topic at the beginning of American history too. And again, this is when you'll see the rise of big businesses. One other thing to note is that the working conditions for those in these factories will continue to be rough, and you will see unions form again and in bigger numbers, and you will see them fight against their working conditions. With limited success for a while, though eventually in American history too, they will start seeing improved working conditions, but not at first. Okay, now let's look at the impact number 4 of the Civil War regarding the laws that benefited the West. Remember that there will be not just westward expansion continuing, but it will be accelerated. And it's going to start off, remember how westward expansion started off with the wagon trains, and with this ideal of manifest destiny. Well, if you look at that painting from Manifest Destiny, you'll see that here come the trains. Here come the transcontinental railroads. So basically, the federal policies that are passed during the laws that are passed during the Civil War are going to create a major acceleration of westward expansion during and especially after the Civil War. And remember, again, the country's not going to be fighting over whether Western states are going to be free or slave, because that issue of slavery has been addressed by the Emancipation Proclamation and later on by the 13th Amendment. So westward expansion is going to accelerate, but that does not mean that there won't be conflict. Think about who is out west and whose land we are about to start pretty much invading, especially when we have the trains and the railroads taking us out there. So that is going to increase conflict with Native Americans. You will see what's known as the Plains Indians Wars as a result of this. Battles you may have heard of before, like the Battle of Little Bighorn, which is sometimes called Custer's Last Stand. You may have heard of the Wounded Knee Massacre. You'll see Native Americans being forced onto reservations in the years during and after the Civil War. So that conflict will continue. And I don't have it mentioned in the notes here, but you will also see a terrible treatment of the environment, because Americans are going to move out West in very large numbers and not really be concerned with conserving the environment. And we are going to start polluting the water. We are going to start trampling a lot of the prairie land. And we are going to hunt the bison from 30 million down to, I've heard 30 million down to less than 1,000. We almost drive them to extinction. So we'll also have a lot of conflict with the environment going forward. And that will be learned more about in American history too. Okay, and of course, the major impact of the Civil War is that you will see the abolition of slavery. Now remember that the initial cause of the Civil War was that the Southern states seceded from the Union because they feared slavery was under attack, and Lincoln's initial purpose was to keep Southern states from seceding. In the end, the Southern secession is going to be stopped and slavery will be ended. So again, the abolition of slavery was not the initial reason for Lincoln fighting the war. In the end, he adds that to the first cause, which was preserving the Union. And in the end, you'll see the abolition of slavery. So that abolition starts in the rebelling states with the Emancipation Proclamation. And then the 13th Amendment is going to build on that and abolish slavery everywhere. And then again, the next question is, what will be the rights of slaves, or excuse me, ex-slaves, once they have been freed? And that's going to be addressed by the 14th and 15th Amendment. It's going to address, the 14th Amendment is going to say that you cannot, or that slaves are citizens. Anyone born here is a citizen, or naturalized, that goes through the citizenship process. They all become citizens. And once you become a citizen, you are entitled to not just rights, but equal rights. According to the 14th Amendment, there's no such thing as second-class citizenship. If you're a citizen, then you have the same rights as every other citizen. And then, of course, the 15th Amendment will say that you cannot deny someone's right to vote based on race. And again, this will mean that all of a sudden you have 4 million people in the southern part of the country especially that have gone from being seen as property to being seen as equals under the law to being able to vote. And by the way, if ex-slaves can vote, they can also run for office, and you will see that happening. And as I said before, the southern states will find ways to undo largely the effects of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And you will not see this equality really getting enforced until the civil rights movement of the 1960s, largely under the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr. But for a short time in the 1860s and 70s, you will see slaves go from being seen as property to being seen as equals under the law and even able to vote and run for office and win positions of power in the government. More on that later on. Finally, one other impact of the Civil War is that the South will be devastated. The Anaconda Plan will do its work. Total war will destroy many of the southern towns. And of course, remember the majority of the southern economy was based on slave labor, and now that is gone. So the southern economy has been upended. The southern culture has been upended, which is a very good thing for ex-slaves, but it's a very bad thing for the rest of the Southerners, and they're going to see their economy as being threatened. They're going to see their old culture as being ruined, and the Old South has been destroyed. We'll see what the New South looks like in later lectures. So thus ends my discussion of the Civil War. I still have 2 lectures left to do, and those 2 lectures will be on the aftermath of the Civil War, the Reconstruction of the South, and the attempted establishment of racial equality in the South. And that will take me 2 lectures to go through. And then I will be done with this unit.